Imagine a land where the mists never quite lift, where ancient forests meet restless seas, and every shadow might conceal friend or foe. Here, on the rugged edge of the world, the destinies of empires and nations collided in a drama of ambition, survival, and resistance. Before we dive into this gripping tale of courage and conflict, I invite you to support this journey. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more stories that bring history to life. Russia's secret war on American soil, the 1802 Native Resistance. With that, let us step into the stormy night where this saga begins. On a remote island off Alaska's coast, Russian forces and their indigenous allies set up camp under the command of company leader Alexander Baranov. As dusk surrendered to night, the landscape seemed to stir. The surf, the trees, and the sand themselves appeared to move. Suddenly, shadowy figures swept through the darkness, ambushing the sentries, slashing into tents, and attacking the startled men. The Russians unleashed gunfire while their native companions fired arrows, but as Baranov later recounted, the attackers wore wooden and metal armor and helmets painted with monstrous faces. No musket ball or shot could penetrate their defenses. In the gloom, they seemed more terrifying than any demon. Some of the hundreds of men in camp escaped by boat, while others held their ground, firing a cannon until reinforcements arrived and the raiders withdrew. Surveying the aftermath, Baranov saw a camp littered with the wounded and dead, his own survival owed to a coat of mail. He and his men were fur traders, pushing the boundaries of the Russian realm in search of fortune. What had begun centuries earlier as Russia's eastward march across Siberia under Ivan the Terrible had now brought these men to the far edge of North America. Their assailants that night were the Tlingit, a formidable people clad in armor, who had initially sought vengeance against their rivals, the Chugach, but, upon encountering the Russians, turned their fury on the newcomers instead. The Tlingit homeland stretched along a fog-shrouded coast, marked by islands and snowy peaks, and fortified by powerful clans and villages. This was the territory Baranov and his men would soon invade, the stage for the coming wars between Russians and Native Americans. Foreigners were arriving in ever greater numbers, bearing the banner of a new empire that would answer to the Russian Tsar. At their head, Alexander Baranov led his company southward, founding a fort in honor of Saint Michael the Archangel. Fort Mikhailovsky was established as a crucial outpost in rich waters. For years, Russians and their native allies had pushed east, aggressively hunting sea otters for their pelts. Amid the cold, evergreen islands, Baranov declared that divine providence favored their mission, proclaiming the glory of Russia everywhere they went. Their aim was clear: seize and cultivate American land that would benefit Russia. Yet resistance was inevitable. 7 years had passed since the harrowing Tlingit assault, and now, with only the fragile consent of a local Tlingit chief, Baranov began constructing Fort Mikhailovsky. A few dozen company men endured the winter in the creaking fort, beset by leaks, scurvy, and constant rumors of native attack. The coastline was dotted with towering totem poles and grand houses, homes to the various Tlingit clans, numbering over 10,000. These people had long defended their lands through warfare. As the Russians asserted the supremacy of a distant emperor, Kalyan of the Raven clan, a Tlingit warrior, was not alone in contemplating armed resistance. Raised to withstand pain, to seek honor in combat, and to avenge blood with blood, Kalyan and his kin moved beneath the ever-present mist, their fleets hidden in the shadows. For generations, Tlingit raiders had brought devastation to their enemies, claiming loot, captives, and retribution. Some warriors fought with bows and arrows, their hair tied in topknots, but the iconic Tlingit fighter charged into battle, clad in layered hide, wooden armor, and fearsome helmets, wielding spears, knives, and other weapons. These formidable warriors found their greatest rivals in the equally armored Haida and Tsimshian peoples. Yet war did not wholly define life here. The rhythms of the region were set by the salmon runs. In warmer months, the Tlingit gathered at fishing camps to harvest and preserve salmon, supplementing their diet with other fish, shellfish, deer, seals, and more. As winter neared, they returned to their sprawling villages, living communally in large houses where shamans performed rituals and leaders displayed their status through generosity and luxury. Jewelry, copper plaques, and robes edged with ermine or puffin down. Commoners wore woven cedar bark, fur, and hides, while slaves, often captured enemies, labored in harsh conditions. These enduring traditions of war and abundance provided the Tlingit with security, surplus, and time for the arts. But Baranov saw that the Tlingit were evolving, adapting to new threats. He forbade his men from trading firearms to them. As the head of the newly chartered Russian-American company, Baranov commanded all Russian merchants in the region, but his countrymen were not the only outsiders. Spanish galleons had traced Alaska's coast in the 1500s, and after Vitus Bering's 1741 expedition, the Tlingit began trading with Spanish, French, and English visitors, exchanging furs for iron to make tools and weapons. They already knew how to work native copper and sometimes acquired iron from shipwrecks of Chinese or Japanese origin. Whispers of rebellion now traveled swiftly from Kalian's village to distant coves and islands, a clandestine summons to rise up. No longer did the Tlingit draw strength from European ports. Instead, it was the ships from Boston that empowered them. To Baranov's growing anxiety, American traders from the young United States began exchanging firearms and gunpowder for otter pelts, pelts that would eventually find their way to Chinese buyers. With this new trade, some Tlingit warriors wielded American muskets and donned armor, fashioned from Chinese coins. Their arsenal expanded with each passing day, signaling that a new era of warfare was about to engulf the region. In the spring of 1802, a grand hunting party set out from the Russian post at Yakutat, comprising Russians and several hundred native allies. Ivan Kuzkov, Baranov's trusted associate, led them southeast along increasingly hostile shores. The old Tlingit clans, angered by the depletion of sea otters and the undermining of their trade, had grown resentful of the Russians. In the years leading up to this, the Russians and their allies had, on occasion, stolen from, imprisoned, and killed Tlingit people. Now, 40 miles from their base, the Tlingit appeared in force, hundreds strong and armed with guns, daggers, and lances. During the skirmish, the Tlingit staged a false retreat to lure the Russians into the forest. Instead, Kuzkov withdrew to a defensible island. Both sides suffered few casualties, but with ammunition running low, Kuzkov negotiated a truce and returned to base to resupply. Unbeknownst to him, this marked the onset of the Great Tlingit Rebellion. Years earlier, when the Kiksadi Tlingit chief permitted the construction of Fort Mikhailovsky, he may have unwittingly bound his clan to the Russian Tsar. By now, the Russians' treatment of their new subjects was widely known. Many of the hunters in the Russian ranks were Aleutian Islanders, themselves colonized and forced into service. The Tlingit, wary of such subjugation, lacked a central authority to unify their clans, but they maintained cohesion through potlatch ceremonies and the exchange of gifts. Each clan belonged to either the Raven or Eagle division, with strict rules requiring marriage between the two. These ancient alliances were now invoked. As Tlingit warriors armed themselves, they called on other indigenous groups, even former foes, to join their cause. In June 1702, more than 1,000 Tlingit, joined by Haida and Shihan allies, converged on Fort Mikhailovsky in a rare show of unity. The Russians and their supporters were overwhelmed, speared, shot, and wiped out where they stood. Kalian led the charge through the fort as defenders retreated to the upper barracks, firing cannons in desperation before being overrun. The dead were left where they fell, and the fort was set ablaze, while the victorious Tlingit seized captives and plundered furs. The next day, a returning hunting party was also ambushed and destroyed. With this victory, the Tlingit had decapitated Russian power in their territory. The shores of Sitka Sound grew eerily quiet in the aftermath. Soon after, a British merchant ship under Captain Henry Barber arrived. Barber recorded the devastation. The Russian post was in ruins, bodies lay scattered and unburied, prey for ravens and wild animals. Over 20 survivors, both Russian and indigenous, had been captured by the Tlingit. Barber, with support from American vessels, invited Kalyan and his uncle, Chief Scout Louts, aboard under the guise of trade, then detained them, threatening execution unless the captives and stolen furs were surrendered. Barber's intentions were far from noble. He kept the furs and ransomed the prisoners, sailing to Kodiak Island, where he extorted a fortune in furs from Baranov in exchange for the survivors' release. Kodiak, far from Tlingit lands, served as Baranov's base, and he survived the rebellion unscathed. Russian officials blamed English and American traders for inciting the uprising, but Baranov had long sensed the Tlingits' growing anger. He had tried to restrain his men from abusing the locals and to keep hunting expeditions away from Tlingit eyes. Yet, as Baranov mourned, none of these precautions had spared them. Many of our brethren, the bravest, perished together with many of our allies at the hands of barbarians in America. He feared that if the Russians did not act swiftly, the lucrative lands of southeast Alaska would be lost forever. Paris. Despite being the official governor, Baranov lacked the resources for immediate retaliation. Months slipped by as he assembled hundreds of men and weapons for a counterattack. In early 1803, he rallied his company. "I address you as faithful sons of the fatherland, bound to our monarch by oath of allegiance, and ask you not to be weak and ungrateful. Let us regain the lost hunting grounds, and by this we shall prove the essence of courage, not a timid but brave spirit of the Russian people." Kalyan and his clan, anticipating the Russian return, prepared for war. They stockpiled gunpowder and arms. Although the weapons of conflict had evolved, the essence of war remained unchanged. On clear nights, the Tlingit gazed at the aurora borealis, believing it to be the spirits of fallen warriors, honored for their valor. The world, as elders taught, was a place of spiritual power, shaped by the raven yegg. The Tlingit revered the intelligence and spirit of animals, bears, wolves, killer whales, eagles, and ravens. Now, the Keksadi Raven clan looked to Kalyan to lead them as war chief. The clan abandoned their old village, relocating to a defensible peninsula in Sitka, where they constructed a formidable palisade 245 feet across at one end, reinforced with gates, timbers, and gun ports for cannons. They named it the Sapling Fort, or Shiski Nu, a bastion built to withstand the coming storm. No measure was too great when it came to safeguarding their people. Memories lingered of the Awa-Uk massacre, when, just 20 years earlier, Baranov's predecessor had overseen the slaughter of some 300 indigenous men, women, and children after they resisted Russian encroachment near Kodiak Island. Now, the summer of 1804 had arrived. Baranov's fleet, composed of around 100 armed Russians, several ships, and a large contingent of indigenous otter hunters, sailed past Tlingit villages to discourage further resistance. Those most deeply involved in the 1802 uprising faced retribution, while others negotiated uneasy truces. Though the far-flung Tlingit settlements had united in rebellion 2 years before, they now hesitated to risk their own safety for the embattled Keksadi clan. Within the Sapling Fort, the Keksadi prepared to stand alone. Baranov gathered his forces at an abandoned Tlingit village, where he encountered the Russian warship Neva and its crew of 41, recently returned from Russia's first circumnavigation. They joined Baranov, bringing additional military strength to the campaign. Meanwhile, Kalyan and his fellow Tlingit leaders urgently sought more gunpowder and firearms. As they returned, the Neva fired upon them, igniting their cargo and causing a deadly explosion. On October 1st, the Russian fleet assembled beyond the shallows of the sapling fort, readying for an assault. According to oral tradition, Kalyan marked his face with charcoal in the pattern of a fallen raven, the war paint of one prepared for death. Donning his raven helmet and wielding a hammer taken from a slain Russian blacksmith, he rallied his warriors as the sun set over the water. The Russians and their allies advanced, dragging artillery behind them. Tlingit gunfire cut into their ranks as they approached the fort's walls. Some attackers faltered, and Tlingit fighters surged from the fort, while Kalyan's contingent struck at the enemy's flanks in a whirlwind of violence. A fallen sailor was hoisted aloft on a Tlingit spear, and Kalyan himself was said to have felled several foes with his hammer. The Russians and their allies retreated to their ships under the protection of cannon fire, leaving about 10 dead and 24 wounded, including Baranov, who had been shot in the arm. The Tlingit had claimed victory on the first day. Over the following days, the fort's sturdy walls withstood intermittent Russian bombardment, yet Kalyan realized their gunpowder would not last. During negotiations, the several hundred Tlingit began a covert evacuation, slipping away into the forest by night. Elders, women, and children first, followed by the warriors on a long, perilous march through cold woods and mountains. Many perished from hunger and exposure during the retreat to Peril Strait. On October 7th, the Russians entered the deserted fort, discovering the bodies of several young children and elderly Tlingit, slain by their own kin, likely because they could not survive the journey. The Russians burned the fort and established a new settlement, naming it New Archangel. The next summer, exiled Kiksadi Tlingit sent delegations to the Russians. Kalyan arrived with an air of authority, described by a Russian captain as the best marksman, always accompanied by up to 20 fine guns. Baranov welcomed his former adversaries, honoring their customs. Over days of ritual dances and songs, the two sides exchanged gifts and prisoners, and Baranov traded a prized copper crest for the right to settle the land around New Archangel. Yet resentment lingered among the northern Tlingit, who suffered hunger as Russians barred them from their traditional fishing grounds and hunted otters along the coast. In retaliation, Tlingit warriors attacked the merchant base at Yakutat, killing all Russians present and burning it to the ground. The fort was never rebuilt. This period marked a global era of upheaval. Empires crumbled, Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, and Lewis and Clark's expedition heralded the beginning of American expansion westward. But in this remote corner of Alaska, the Tlingit had fractured the Russian frontier. While New Archangel became the capital of Russian America, Kuskov established the next Russian post far south in California, distancing himself from the armed Pacific Northwest peoples who had disrupted his ventures. The Russian Native American Wars in southeast Alaska ended not in outright conquest, but in a negotiated coexistence. When Baranov retired in 1818, Tlingit chiefs, including Kalyan, long respected for his intelligence and valor, came to bid him farewell. At 71, Baranov sailed for Russia, but died before reaching his homeland. Russian merchants had long demanded tribute and labor from indigenous peoples as they expanded across Alaska. It was the fierce resistance of Tlingit warriors and later the advocacy of Russian Orthodox missionaries that brought reform. In the 1820s, the Tsar decreed that merchants were forbidden from taxing or demanding tribute from the Tlingit and neighboring peoples, instructing them to preserve goodwill and avoid anything that might threaten native independence. There would be no flood of Russian settlers, no mass exile. Kalyan enjoyed a long tenure as chief, and his clan was eventually allowed to return to Sitka. Along the coast, canoes, towering totems, and grand clan houses continued to define the enduring lands of the Tlingit. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into history, please subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge and inspire. Before you go, consider this. What can the Tlingit resistance teach us about the power of cultural identity? And how can their story help us better honor Indigenous voices today? See you in the next video.